Oh, good afternoon. It is a real pleasure for me to be able to introduce our speakers today. Not only is this a subject that I've been interested in for some time, but also both Emily and Emily are fabulous people that I've gotten the good fortune to know in the last couple of years, hopefully in the future even better. And they have some interesting and important things to say. So welcome to this first in our winter semester lecture series for the Fraser Center for Workplace Issues. I am Elizabeth Powell, Professor of History and Director of Labor at Wayne. Our lecture today focuses on body politics of the workplace, this issue of sexual harassment, and how that issue undergirds new organizing in the fields of service and hospitality. I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies Program, the Department of History, and the Center for Gender and Sexuality, as well as our host, the Reuther Library, and the work of staff and faculty affiliates, especially, as you well know, Sean O'Brien and Jamie McQuaid. Our speaker today is Emily Labarbera-Twarog, Associate Professor of the Labor Education Program, Co-Director of the Regina B. Polk Women's Labor Leadership Programs, and Ronald and Lilia Peters Faculty Scholar at the School of Labor and Employment Relations, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I think your title is no longer than mine.
Yeah, it's career aspirations.
Emily received her PhD in American History, which is why we claim her, at the University of Illinois, Chicago, after graduating from the University of Massachusetts Amherst with a broad interdisciplinary background. Professor Labarbera-Twarog's publications include her book, Politics of the Pantry, Housewives, Food and Consumer Protest in 20th Century America, and numerous articles, reports, and book chapters on sexual harassment and women's labor union leadership. She has been actively involved as well in the Labor and Working Class History Association, and is an associate editor at both Labor Studies Journal and Labor Studies in Working Class History of the Americas. Her current book project, Hands Off, A History of Fighting Back Against Sexual Harassment in the American Workplace, is a historical examination of how service sector workers organize to make their jobs safer. Our commentator and discussant today is Anne-Marie Strassel, a union leader, communications director, artist, and historian with expertise in women's labor and cultural production. She holds a PhD in American Studies from Yale University, and with over 20 years of experience in the labor movement, has served as a communications director for Unite Here, a labor union representing over 300,000 workers across America. I would like you to please welcome Professor Emily Labarbera-Twarog and Anne-Marie Strassel of Unite.
Everybody for being here. Can you all hear me okay? So Anne-Marie and I, discussed our plan. So I'm going to do like some talking stuff, take you through my PowerPoint, and then we have a set of questions that we're going to sort of engage in a discussion, and then we would like to open it up to all of you to ask questions about, well, not anything, but anything related to this. Can't guarantee wide knowledge on everything. This or something related, we're happy to accept those. So. And I have some, I don't tend to read, but I have some parts I'm going to read and some parts I'll just kind of talk off the cuff. So as Professor Powell mentioned, I am working on a book project. This is kind of one little snippet of that book project, and then hopefully actually kind of a broader research article after the book is done. Because I kind of, as I started working on it, realized there's no way I'm going to get enough data for the book itself. But first I wanted to talk about why I do the research I do, because I think it's really important to ground, well, for me, it's really important to ground myself in the work that I do. So one, I really love hotels. I grew up watching Fawlty Towers. My favorite TV show was this hotel show that took place in San Francisco with Connie Selica. I thought she was so cool, and Bob Newhart's show. And so, I'm aging myself, I realize. But these were like my favorite shows, like the sort of mystique of a hotel. I grew up in rural Maine, hated it. It was like all about fantasy and escape and getting out. And of course, the TV show Hotel was in this really, if you've ever been to St. Francis in San Francisco, it is this gorgeous, fantastical hotel. And this recent book just came out about hotels, and I thought this was a really poignant quote, thinking about how hotels kind of afford the perfect starting point for analyzing clashes between globalization and domestic, social, and political prejudices, kind of transposing all that into everyday experience. And so as we think about hotels as like a concept, an actual physical space, as well as a workplace, it gets really complicated. So for me, because I love hotels, I went and worked in one. But I spent a good chunk of my time before I became a professor working in food service. So I've been a line cook, a sous chef, a dishwasher. For a brief moment in time, I had my own little scone company in San Francisco called Romancing the Scone. The slogan was flaky, not cakey. And I've been a pastry chef and a bread breaker, and I did get fired as a room attendant at a bed and breakfast. I'm very bad at that. And I spent 5 years, my last gig in food service, as a server in a unionized hotel, and that all those jobs before were non-union. And I am lucky enough to say they were actually overall very positive, wonderful experiences, and I still miss food service. And in fact, we had a little talk yesterday, myself and Dr. Fau and someone else, we were talking about the future of academia. And I remember thinking when I was getting my PhD at UIC that like, well, my server job's really good. I have a pension, I have health insurance, I make a decent wage. So if this whole PhD thing doesn't really pan out, I just go back to the hotels. I really like working there, which would have been, I admittedly, like a little bit of a downer, but it did come with the pension and health insurance. So, but that's kind of what has informed my work, whether it was the book I wrote before, which focused on food protests. And I will say the Reuther played a central part in that book. I did almost all my research here, so it's really lovely to be back here at there. Okay, so my overall book, as has already been mentioned, is called Hands Off: A History of Fighting Back Against Sexual Harassment in the American Workplace. My kids say that's too much of a mouthful of the title, but that's what academic books do. And it really is broadly looking at how service sector workers, and today I'm going to be talking about hotel and restaurant workers specifically, but my book is looking at hospitality, flight attendants, and domestic workers, basically from 1936, sort of the formation of official, private sector labor law in the United States, up until 2018 and the confirmation of Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. I, of course, when I made that plan, was hoping the book would be done already. So I think I'm just not going to deal with the current administration, to be honest. It's like the book just needs to get done. Only as far as Kavanaugh goes. But today we're going to really be talking about how is it possible and what does it mean to use collective bargaining in a hospitality context, to challenge this hospitality idea that the consumer, the guest is always right. I mean, that is the key, right? Like I learned you have to anticipate the guest's needs and provide them before the guest even knows they want them, right? That makes you a good server, a good host. But also, like, how do we reframe this industry that emphasizes, respect and dignity? How do we make sure workers are getting that respect and dignity? And how is it possible to sort of proactively prevent sexual harassment through training and deliberate culture change? And like, can we kind of bake that into collective bargaining agreements? And as we'll see, collective bargaining agreements actually haven't historically had much of anything to say about sexual harassment, even in the hospitality industry. And outside of that industry, really nothing at all. So that's kind of the plan. So before I get there, I'm gonna read a little bit and then we'll shift gears. So in the US, hotels were and are sort of indicative of manifest destiny. This idea of westward expansion, the shift from rural to urban, and the country inching towards economic and political global dominance. This is sort of the evolution of the hotel. And as one scholar of hotels puts it, quote, luxury hotels contributed to a burgeoning civil society that existed at the intersection of political and economic networks. They supported the growth of a new public sphere. American urban luxury hotels intentionally conferred a contrived and highly prized social standing upon all of those who visited and lived within. So that's kind of the hotel context. And in the early 20th century, this is me writing now. In the early 20th century, the proliferation of the hospitality industry opened up new job opportunities for young, primarily white, usually immigrant women seeking employment outside of manufacturing and private households. And for many reasons, this was very appealing. Certainly hotels were more attractive places to work, given the grandeur and the cleanliness of the spaces. They were a far cry from the smells and noises and industrial dangers found in manufacturing jobs. They were much better than doing piecework out of a very, tight living situation. Working in a hotel meant that you were dressed in a clean uniform. You worked in spaces that reflected the gilded wealth of the time and were allowed glimpses into how the wealthy lived. And we have to remember, like, early 20th century, we're talking about, is it called the Booker Hotel downtown? Like, yeah, I mean, we're talking like big, beautiful hotel. We're not talking about like the roadway, or the red carpet inn along the highway. We're talking lovely, beautiful hotels that are often established right next to railroad stations, as the United States expands and is expanding railways as well. So in contrast to domestic service, where you're working side by side with another woman rather than alone in the walls of a private home. So you're also, you have this sort of collective working experience that you might not have otherwise if you're doing piecework or working as domestic. And there was a similar appeal for women in restaurant work. That hotels and restaurants were these exciting public spaces for young women whose lives often centered on their family home rather than the public spaces of downtown. And as one 1916 report noted, waiting tables in restaurants appeals to young girls because she sees herself and talks to a great many people. She likes the noise and bustle and cheerful atmosphere of the dining room. And the Consumers League of New York City did a series of interviews with sort of 1,000 hotel and restaurant workers in New York City, and these are some quotes from there. But of course, this exposure comes with potential hazards, right? Employers actively sought young, attractive white women to appeal to an overwhelmingly clientele. One waitress told researchers from the Consumers League of New York, quote, when the girls get to looking bad, they are laid off and someone else is put in their place. So getting hired into a hospitality job wasn't necessarily an easy task. There was a hierarchy of jobs that definitely reflected the racism and sexism of the time. I would say that is still true today. Better paying jobs in the front of the house were given to young, attractive white women, while back of the house jobs, such as housemaid, I'm not actually using that term, but this is the term of the time. Housemaids and cleaners are reserved for older, quote, less attractive women or women of color. Another quote from the Consumers League report, it is her appearance which counts, not her experience. If the candidate is young and nice looking, and there is a job open, she will get it. If she is older and getting fat, all the experience in the world will do her no good. So that's kind of the context in which hotels are evolving. So we think about why hospitality is more complex. It's also complex because of what I'm calling the menage a trois of hospitality, right? This triangular relationship between the employer, the worker, and the guest. So the service sector demands a complex set of relationships beyond those of the employer and the employee. So how many here have ever worked in the service? And I know we have, yeah, you all know, right? Like it's complicated, right? And we have the early pre-talk discussion was about even now getting sexually harassed in workers, right? So this is not news to you, right? But what is important to think about is the entire industry was established on it. Like this is not an accident. The reason you're still experiencing this is because this is like the origin story of the industry as a whole, right? So the introduction of the customer, the person paying for and receiving the service, means that workers must not only navigate the social climate of their workplace, but also the ongoing interactions with the customers who are unpredictable and maybe demanding. This creates a menage a trois style relationship that historically has suppressed a worker's ability to voice their workplace concerns to their employer or the guest, especially within the context, right, of sexual harassment. So a historical study of the hospitality industry reveals these complexities well. In 1916, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics reported, quote, many of the waitresses complain of the annoying attention of male customers. Many girls said, however, that if they speak sharply to a customer or offend him, they are likely to be reprimanded by the head waitress and may even lose their position. So of course we can imagine, it's hard enough right now in 2026, but let's back up 100 plus years to the social norms of that time to speak against the worker, against the customer. Immediately it was the employee that was put out, right? Not the guest, not the manager, but the employee. Yet this isn't just a fluke. In fact, the modern hospitality industry was developed around these expectations. As hotels grew in number and use in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and moved away from the sort of small guest house model, the vision of the hotel owners was to mimic social expectations and norms. The primary guests in these early hotels were not families, but rather male business travelers who sought the comforts of home away from home. And this means more than a comfortable bed and warm meal. It was also meant to be a total experience. The hotel became a gendered microcosm of society. The dynamic of the masculine bartender, who functioned as the friend and pal, allowed patrons to have their needs met through camaraderie and fun. The bar functioned as a public space that mirrored the expectations of public social norms. Meanwhile, housemaids, in the parlance of the time, existed in the realm of sort of a mock private sphere, the temporary home to the patron, and it was expected to meet the needs of the male patrons through providing the comforts of home. The management structure of the hotel industry bolstered the inequity and abusiveness of a racially gendered public and private sphere. One young worker commented, "I can't keep a job longer than 4 months because I get so nervous," right? And so this kind of speaks to this issue of that tension. See if I want to talk about this now. All right, so the other piece of this that's critical is that tipping becomes a big critique, a big issue within this, right? I think I said that quote already. Yeah, so on wages, this idea of this discrimination against older workers illustrates the unfairness of tips as part of workers' wage. And so the advice was often to fix yourself up, don't be bashful. The ones who get tips are those that stick around and sass them back and make you notice. And I don't know how many of you have ever been servers, but I definitely noticed that. Like the sassier I got, the better my tips, right? And there is like a whole psychology and sociology of serving. Like when I worked in the hotel, it was a very swanky hotel. And on Saturday nights, I worked with, it was me and then my coworker who was a sort of flamboyantly gay man. And we had this whole sociology of the dining room. We were the only ones that pulled our tips. We decided Saturday nights, just the two of us, we'd pool our tips. And every Saturday night. And we would kind of like, as the guests would come in, we'd be like, all right, who should take them? Should you take them or should I take them? And then if it got really busy, we'd like obviously do our stations. But like, if it was clearly, we worked in the theater district of Chicago, and there was like a prefix theater menu that was kind of affordable. So if like a working class family came in, obviously like from the suburbs, the outer burbs, and they were like in the city for a good time, and they've decided to splurge on this meal, I would wait on them because like I could connect with them was the idea, right? And then if like these kind of high maintenance girls came in, like he would wait on them. And it really maximized our tipping, like really breaking it all down. And it also kind of, I think, buffered us against sexual harassment in other ways as well. So thinking, but thinking that this is all the way back to 1922, 1916, I mean, this is the industry, right? So from the beginning, the tipping system was established to allow employers to pay workers less, placing the onus on the customer to pay tips, presumably based on the quality of the service. This, of course, is not an objective system that pays wages based on equal pay for equal work. Workers and activists were early critics of the system. Quote, the discrimination against the older workers, blah, 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 was to fix yourself up and ingratiate yourselves with the guest. Of course, the danger to the girl who ingratiates herself is only too evident. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics report, many of the waitresses complained of annoying attention by male customers. And I will say doing research on sexual harassment is incredibly challenging because the term, does anybody know what year the term was coined? Sexual harassment? It has a name, right? What year did we give it a name?
70s or 80s.
1976, right? So 1976, this thing, this like attention of male customers gets a name. So how do you do research on something that doesn't have a name? Is, you know, annoying attention, right? So you have to like spend a lot of time going through the archives and try. I have lots of synonyms for sexual harassment that I spend time going through the archives looking at this. So the tipping system depended on the implicit and explicit sexualization of female waitstaff. In the early days of restaurants, the majority of female waitstaff were under 30 years old, unmarried immigrants from Europe in the sort of urban areas, northern urban areas. Employers actively sought this demographic of workers, allowing a system of dating male customers. In some cases, the exchange between a waitress and a male customer ended at the restaurant door, while other women actively dated their customers in the hopes of financial security. And this can be translated into the early days of being a flight attendant as well. The discontinuation of tipping would, by extension, allow female waitstaff to simply do their jobs without any implied attraction or temptation between themselves and their customers. And as a result, the appeal of the restaurant in the eyes of the owner potentially diminishes for the male patron. So this concern, and I would argue continues to drive today, owners' opposition to the discontinuation of the tipping system. Okay, so if we think about all of that, I have any other? I think I got most of this. Yeah, these are just different quotes from, the first half of the 20th century about what it was like to work in hospitality. You can't talk back to people. I learned that it pays to keep quiet and just not say anything when a customer gets too excited, right? So there are all sorts of ways in which human relations, the industry itself is making sure that employees feel dependent on this like sort of contrived relationship with the employer. All right, so that's kind of the context. This slide is kind of like the theoretical slide. I'm just gonna, so in the book itself, I talk more about how this idea of sexual harassment is a way to really represent intersectionality, and the body is a way to sort of discuss intersectionality. The body becomes this important representation of our work and our resistance. So I want to make sure, though, that in this book, the book really isn't talking about, and my research isn't really talking about like women's bodies, people's bodies as victim spaces, but more as spaces of resistance. So the bulk of the book, while it frames it in this idea of embodied intersectionality, each chapter in the book is how workers resisted this harassment, right? So one chapter looks at the professionalization of the industry and how they created the industry to be more professional and got training, and it developed their confidence. Another is looking at unionization. Another is looking at how oftentimes domestic workers would take their perpetrators to court, the fight for legislation, and then community organizing. And many times the women's bodies are used as ways to actually resist this harassment, right? So these are just some of the sort of theoretical frameworks I'm thinking about. I did some interviews with room attendants. This is one of my more recent ones with a room attendant in Las Vegas. And just thinking back on that earlier quote from the early 20th century about a woman's body and like who would be put in front of the house, who would be put in back of the house. This only happened in the 21st century. When she first moved to Las Vegas, she applied for and got a job as a room attendant in a hotel. And she said, I got discriminated because I was a heavyset woman. At my first housekeeping job, I thought I was doing good. At the end of the shift, they called me into the office and said, you're too big. You can't get on your knees and clean, so we don't need you, right? And so even today, right, this idea of like telling a woman what her body is capable of doing and not letting a woman decide that for herself but also it's like how the industry wanted their hotel to look, right? And you don't represent what the message we're trying to send to our clientele, right? Despite the fact that she's quite good at scrubbing toilets and actually loves being a room attendant. She now works at another hotel. She's a steward in that hotel and quite enjoys it. Let me skip that one. So I want to talk a bit about collective bargaining, and then we'll segue into our conversation between myself and Anne-Marie. So I began thinking about how could collective bargaining be another tool in this resistance. So my methodology for this is I began collecting union contracts from Unite Here, or HERE, as it was before it was a merger of two unions. Documenting and collating the language articles, placing them in sort of a larger historical context. And I've also been engaging in interviews with union leaders, staff, and members involved in the collective bargaining. And I wanted to really understand how is collective bargaining, that's CBA, language changed in response to larger social pressures? Is negotiating this language a point of contention or collaboration? And has there been a measurable positive impact of this language in the workplace? I can tell you that I don't have the answer to all these questions yet, but I'm in the process of doing the research. I did think that this framework was really useful. I got this framework from interviewing leaders of Unite Here in Boston, where they kind of broke down how sexual harassment's been viewed in the industry. So pre-1990s, this traditional narrative that I kind of just went through, was the focus was really on harassment by managers, maybe and coworkers harassing other coworkers, but then it really was like the blame was always put on the worker. It was always the worker's fault. The workers did not feel like they could speak up. Management, well, either participating in the harassment or just choosing to turn a blind eye to it, really didn't want to address it. In the 1990s, there's kind of a professionalization of the industry. There's a move by the hotel industry to kind of deal with this more, and there's training of hotel managers. And this wasn't just in the hotel industry or hospitality, this was kind of across the board. They did note, however, that in the hotel context, subcontractors were often, the folks who are brought in to like run a separate, if you have a big hotel, like run maybe a separate restaurant or a cafe within that hotel, there often remained rampant harassment. And in fact, in Boston, they've talked about basically subcontractor babies that, would happen, right, because of this harassment. But does anybody know kind of why 1990s would maybe be a pivotal point to make this shift? What was happening in the early 1990s? What big Supreme Court thing happened?
Anita Hill Thomas.
Yeah, Anita Hill Clarence Thomas, right? So the Hill Thomas debacle, right, brings attention to sexual harassment. It's like we get the term in the 1970s. We sort of talk about it in the 80s, even in the women's movement. There's some talk about it, but the 1990s, it kind of skyrockets, right? Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas were finally for those of you who are very young in the room, right? Everybody watched news together at night at the same time on a television in the living room, because we had one TV. There were, if you count PBS, there were 4 stations. You were loyal. We were an ABC family. We really liked Peter Jennings, right? So everybody was watching this at the same time, right? Not in real time necessarily, although I was in college and I was at UMass Amherst in the General Women's Studies department, and we had a little black and white TV, and we would run from class to watch the hearings and then go back to class. And we're all sort of watching this, right? So yeah, that was a major cultural turning point. And so there began this okay, now we need to do something, because all these women are going to start filing lawsuits. So there was this sort of professionalization, and then more contemporary, they kind of framed it as this new frontier of organizing, where guest behavior is now on the chopping block, right? That the worker can make a complaint against the guest, and the guest should be, if the guest is doing something bad, or even if they think he's doing something bad, the guest is to blame and not the worker. But the worker still has to have enough courage to speak up and say something and believe that their manager is actually going to have their back, right? And this is where this collective bargaining language and training programs kind of come in. Anybody kind of guess why the early 21st century might be another turning point in hotel industries anyway? Yeah.
The dominant first con. So
Right, another bad guy, right? Not to blame all the guys, but you know, yeah, Dominic Strauss-Kahn, right? Who gets, huh? He gets, you know, he's found guilty of like, you know, raping room attendant, right, in New York, and it hits the front pages again, right? So again, we have this like very public, and then it leads to the Me Too movement, and then we have, of course, Weinstein, and so there's been like this sort of continuum upset. But again, like, I mean, come on, like early 1990s all the way. I mean, there's still big lag times in between, but now there's been this shift to really thinking about guest behavior. So what does that kind of look like in collective bargaining agreements? So in the United States, you may or may not know, there is no legal mandate that unions have to file their collective bargaining agreement with like the Department of Labor or anything. So if you want to find all the union contracts, you just basically have to like have a really great research assistant who knows how to use the Wayback Machine on the internet and find the contracts for you, or have a really good relationship with a union. In Canada, they all have to be filed with their Ministry of Labor, which makes researching a lot easier there. So far my research assistant has found 90 on the online. But what's interesting, so we went through them. Well, let me be honest. She went through them and created a spreadsheet, and then I made a pretty slide with her information. Brenda's awesome. And there's pretty consistently been like, and I just had her do from like 2000 present, which is why the dates are what they are. Discrimination, non-discrimination language, pretty standard. And it doesn't say much. I mean, it's like, don't discriminate is basically what it says. But very little on sexual harassment, diversity, equity, equal opportunity, respect, and dignity or harassment until very recently. So we have 7 here, and I'm going to show some examples of contract language. But basically, you know, what the past practice has been around sexual harassment and other kinds of discrimination when you're part of negotiating a contract, which I have been in other industries, is just to kind of defer to the state law or the federal law. So discrimination is already handled by state law, discrimination is handled by federal law, that supersedes the collective bargaining agreement. Therefore, we don't have to put anything in the collective bargaining agreement because that law already stands, right? Or in the case of sexual harassment, which also has, you know, is illegal because of the Civil Rights Act, and depending on what your state law says, there's numbers of ways in which sexual harassment is illegal. The employer will likely, if it's a big company, have some kind of like policy on it in their, you know, corporate handbook. So there are all these ways in which discrimination, sexual harassment is kind of dealt with without being in a collective bargaining agreement. I would argue that one of the problems with that is that, you know, almost no unions and the workers have no idea what the state and federal laws are, right? So where are they getting their information about what their rights are in the workplace? If you're in a unionized workplace, you're reading your collective bargaining agreement. You know, it's only the most nerdy union member that's like highlighting their bargaining and then like referencing the state and federal law. Like most union members are not doing that. They see what's in their bargaining agreement. And if it's silent on these issues, then there's little left to do. So that's where having really explicit language and training comes into play. This is some older language that still exists in most of the Unite Here contracts. Hotel guest relations. Every hotel employee will at all times show respect and courtesy for hotel guests. This respect is shown in their communications, conduct, and other actions in interacting with hotel guests. Violations of this policy will result in either progressive discipline or, if the employee's conduct is so egregious, immediate termination. Right? So this is like standard boilerplate in most hotel contracts, which gives us implies what, basically, that if there's no language, if the contract's silent on sexual harassment, how does this make you feel as a worker? You feel like you have the right to speak up against the harassment? No, right? You're like, I gotta be nice. I gotta show respect and courtesy. And there have been efforts now, even though they've been adding in the sexual harassment workplace violent language to like pull this out, but the employers, hotels are still very resistant to pull that out of the contract. Now, the new language that's been added in kind of counterbalances that, right? So, and it's really important. So a collective bargaining agreement is between who? The workers and the employer, right? That's really like if you're filing a grievance, if the employer has violated the collective bargaining agreement, you have like the ability to file a grievance. What's important about this language is the employer agrees to give priority consideration to any grievance involving sexual harassment, whether from supervisors, employees, or customers. And that's a big difference here because up until recently, it's really just been between, you know, if you have a supervisor, a manager is harassing an employee, fine, we'll deal with that. But other employees or the customer has often been seen as like, that's not really what the contract covers, right? But now they've added that language into the contract, which means that there's like more of an ability to address any kind of harassment that's going on. And in fact, most of the harassment that's happening in hotels, hospitality, or workplaces in general is often between worker and worker. And in the case of customer service, customers and workers, right? It's with the supervisors, of course, it still happens. This isn't to say it doesn't, but by and large, the most common are between two sets of workers who are kind of equal in stature. So that's some language that's being like added in today. Let's see there. This language is hysterical, partly because my name is in it. So this was written into a contract in Chicago. There was a big grievance at the airport. The airport employer was HMS Host, which, you know, provides like the food service and the little, you know, shops where you buy your newspaper and your water, etc. So the workers at HMS Host were experiencing really extreme rates of sexual harassment and racial discrimination, like really, really, really bad. And the union, Local 1, filed a grievance against HMS Host, and they won the grievance, which is great. The harassment and discrimination was by supervisors against the workers. It wasn't customer to worker, worker to worker. It was supervisors to workers. It was a pretty clear-cut case of within the collective bargaining agreement. And so they settled the grievance, but one of the things they wrote into the grievance, so before they got to the collective bargaining agreement, but the grievance was that all of the supervisors that worked for HMS Host, so people who were not included, who were not members of the union, because they were supervisory, all the supervisors had to go through basically a sensitivity training on discrimination and sexual harassment. And the union got to choose who was going to conduct that training. And so they hired me because I work at a school of labor and employment relations to conduct that training. And I brought in some community partners, and we conducted this training with like, I think we did 4 trainings in the basement of O'Hare Airport with all these supervisors. And it was I won't go into it simply on time. It was a fascinating experience and really powerful, actually. We had to bring in like a counselor because like people kept leaving because they were so emotionally, like the stuff we were talking about was like bringing up real issues. The supervisors were getting very emotional. And so they thought that it was so effective that they actually, when they got to bargaining the next time around, they bargained it into the collective bargaining agreement. That now the company is going to have to provide this DEI training, which is basically sexual harassment training and anti-discrimination training. And then I'm going to do it. or I think it says like, or in the event that I can't do it, whoever I say should do it, which is hysterical. And that the company is going to pay for the shop stewards to do these, and they're going to pay for it, and blah, 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 blah. And that I'm, you know, my school is going to get paid for me to do this. And so now it's written in. So this is like above and beyond, right? And Bodrick Barnes was a union leader at HMS Host. He passed away. He ended up working for the union. He was this amazing guy. And so they named it after him, which is awesome. I will say, as amazing as I think this is, and it was written into the 2021-2027 contract, we have yet to actually do this. Right? So that's the other challenge, right? It's like we can write whatever we want into a collective bargaining agreement, but if it doesn't actually happen. You know, I've met with the union, and this isn't to throw the union under the bus, but like they're really busy with a lot of stuff. And this means like a whole nother layer of, organizing and pulling something together. And I'm not really, despite the fact that I'm named here, I'm not the person who's going to coordinate that, right? It's between the union and HMS host to make that happen. And it just hasn't happened yet, which is unfortunate. But I think does, have the potential to be kind of exciting. Should we stop now and do our conversation? I've lost track of how much time we've got. Am I good still? What time is it?
Don't worry about time.
We're fine? Okay. So I'm just going to talk quickly a more theoretical framing. So that's some examples of what the contract language currently looks like. There is some kind of boilerplate language that Unite Here International has sent off to the locals to say it'd be great to get this into the collective bargaining agreements. From my discussions with folks in the different cities, it's pretty doable. I mean, we're at this phase where they're like, sure, of course, let's put in sexual harassment language. But I think there's a bigger issue with bargaining just outside of the hospitality industry as a whole. It's why do we put sexual harassment language into the contract? And so many unions don't even think about putting it in. And in Europe, they kind of call this equality bargaining. So this is, they think of it as gender equality, equality awareness, or special measures that we would include in the collective bargaining agreement. And while on the face of it, that sounds like a great idea, personally, I think this is still carving out as this is special. This is just for those other, now women are 50% of the population. We're also including LGBTQ folks in here, workers of color. I mean, it's much broader, and depending on the industry, all those folks are going to be potentially in the majority of the workplace. So this idea that we want equality bargaining and we're going to have these sort of awareness and carve outs, to me is still minimizing the issue and not elevating it to sort of the importance of wages, hours, health, and safety. So I would not advocate for this idea of equality bargaining. I'm kind of a critic of it. There's another kind of bargaining that's also sort of come out that's called kind of solidarity bargaining. I don't know if I've updated this slide. This framework kind of fits in the culture of bargaining, and they, the idea that the European Trade Union Confederation is kind of putting forward is oh, we're going to gender mainstream. So we're going to talk about this in terms of solidarity. Again, I think this notion of solidarity implies that somehow we're men and women, or white workers and workers of color, or LGBTQ workers and straight workers, or cis or trans, that we're all sort of in tension with one another, and we need to be in solidarity with one another, rather than we're all just a bunch of workers in a workplace, I think is another problem. But this is another kind of rhetoric that's being used in Europe to talk about bargaining. And I will say that, I mean, what's nice about European context in terms of human relations and human resources and unions, they are actually having a dialogue about what we should be doing at the bargaining table. There's sort of an anti-intellectualism in the United States, and I don't see that same kind of dialogue happening within labor unions in the US. I would argue that we should just call it health and safety, right? That this is just about having a safe work environment. So it's you have your PPE, right, for whatever your job is, steel-toed boots, your mask, gloves, whatever. And you want to be safe at work, right? You don't want to worry about being harassed. And we also want to think about the fact that if a worker is experiencing some kind of harassment, it also means they're likely not 100% paying attention to their job and not able to do their job as well either, right? So depending on what industry you're in, I do a lot of teaching around this in the building trades. If someone is distracted and feeling nervous about the people around them, then they're going to be bad at their job and put themselves or others at risk, or not build something as well as they could. Similarly, in hospitality, you're just not going to be as present, right? It's like the quote from the young woman in the 19 teens, right? That she's quitting her job every 4 months because she's getting so nervous. So why aren't we just talking about this as a health and safety issue? Why isn't sexual harassment actually under health and safety in the collective bargaining agreement, right? And health and safety is a mandatory subject of bargaining. So why isn't it just baked into every set of negotiations, part of the negotiations? Now, I did a very informal, unscientific survey of my husband, who is a union organizer, has been for almost 30 years, and negotiates contracts. And so in the kitchen, I was like, so do employers resist, talking about sexual harassment? And he's like, no, because they would look like assholes, right? Like they would look bad if they were like, no, we're not going to talk about this. So they're willing to talk about it, but are we really getting into the nitty gritty and thinking about it in the framework of health and safety? And so again, this interview I did with Sheila, who I quoted from earlier, I thought this was like, in a nutshell, exactly it, right? I have a guest room attendant come to me because she faced some sexual harassment and she felt comfortable enough coming to me because she knows that she's a stop steward. And she said, and she was scared. And the guest room attendant said, are they going to retaliate against me, the management? How are they going to feel? And I told her, it doesn't matter. It's your safety, right? And and without prompting for me, she's like, this is about safety at the workplace, right? So if we approach bargaining around sexual harassment as a special topic, it implies that it's not this mandatory subject of bargaining. It doesn't fit within the framework of health and safety. And I think the problem with this other language of equality bargaining or bargaining for the common good or solidarity bargaining, these other kinds of terms implies that this is somehow a specialty item that we should be adding in, right? But in fact, it's already part of a system that we should be bargaining around. All right, well, that's actually it. So thank you. That's good. That's the information. So I think we're gonna have a conversation, right?
Well, my chair.
Or your chair, I'll put the chair. Like that.
First of all, let's give another round of applause for Ronald. I think this work is so important, and I will just say, as somebody who's worked with Unite Here for the last 20 years, that 2011 Dominique Strauss-Kahn case was an absolutely pivotal moment. I was campaigning in the hotel industry and on the front lines of doing media. We were championing all kinds of issues around health and safety, really related to the workload that people who do hotel housekeeping work do. It's a very difficult, physically demanding job that can break down bodies over time. But I will tell you, when we started to get press interest around this case, which came to us in part because they were looking for broader perspective, but also because the woman who came forward to accuse Dominique Strauss-Kahn was in fact also a union member at one of our hotels in New York City. They asked all kinds of questions about how prevalent is this? And I will be honest, we did not have the answers. And I had been working day in, day out with hundreds of women. I had trained tons of women and talked to tons of women about their experience doing it at the job. And I just realized, boy, if we widen the aperture, there's another level to the experience, the day-to-day experience. And of course, assault is relatively rare, but the daily indignities that many women experience on the job, from you're taking up something to a customer's room and they're showing up in just a towel or less, very common.
Yeah.
These are things that almost every single person who's doing housekeeping work will tell you they've experienced it in some level, like, not to mention all of these other things. So I just want to say this is absolutely, that was a real eye-opener to me about our own kind of blindness within the union, even in an area of work where we were really trying to pay attention. And of course, so much has followed since that time to really widen this. There's also a cultural blindness to this issue. But as I reflected at that time and I thought about this case ever since, it did feel to me like that story probably never would have happened if she had worked in a non-union hotel.
Right. Exactly.
And so one of the questions I have for you is just if you can just share from your research and your writing, obviously the union contract that you shared with us today is a powerful tool for how workers are taking control of their work environment and have the ability to create some kind of culture of accountability. But are there other strategies that, union workers have at their disposal just by simply being part of a union, or how does that make a difference on these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think for union workers, it's, you know, so many of the contracts don't have this language in it yet, so they're not, you know, necessarily relying on the language anyway. But I think that, you know, like in the case of Sheila, was talking about, you know, when I interviewed her, she talked about how she would train the other room attendants. So young room attendants, you know, she's been doing it for years. She gave them all of her tips, right? And these are not things that are like outlined in any manual, right? Like put your cart, like you're supposed to park your room service cart like in the doorway,
Yeah.
right? So you're propping open the door. And she's like, the number of room attendants who don't do this drives me nuts. Like she's trained them and trained them and trained them that like this is safety first. Like make sure your cart's in the door, so your door is open, the door's never closed. You're not like in a room with the door closed, and that makes you more vulnerable. And so I think that like just one-on-one like training with a more experienced room attendant, if the room attendant is like really on top of it, which I think in the union a lot of them are, they tend to be stewards, they will train the up and coming room attendants on all the like best practices to stay safe. And so that's not even like in the contract, right? That's just like basic logic about like, this is your new job, this is the context. And, you know, in Chicago, and after the Dominique Strauss-Kahn case, they did a big survey of sexual harassment in the hospitality industry. And when the workers went out to do these surveys with workers, they started asking them like, well, have you ever been sexually harassed? And all the workers were like, no. And they're like, that's not possible, right? Like statistically, we know this is impossible. And then they started asking things like, you know, has anyone ever touched you? Well, yeah, but that's part of the job. Or, you know, has anybody been naked when you come into the hotel room? Well, yeah, but that happens all the time, you know, and they had to, you know, that they didn't understand that that was like wrong, but they didn't really have a word for it. They hadn't given it the name sexual harassment. That seemed like something more extreme to them, right? Like that they were going to be like physical assault, right? Like that was, you know, the Dominique Strauss-Kahn example, right? Like that was sexual harassment. This is just what you do when you have the job. And they had, you know, there had to be a lot of education around that. So I think the education is a really critical part, and like you said, changing the culture, right, of like what's expected and what's the standard and what shouldn't be tolerated, and having the feeling that they can speak to the manager. There of course has been legislation that's been passed now in some states around having panic buttons, right? So if anything is happening when you're on the shop floor, you can press this panic button. It's supposed to be a silent button that connects to security that will alert them that there's an issue. And this isn't just around sexual harassment. Like if a customer is like having a health issue or a worker's having a health issue, you can, you know, if you're in a really big account. I went to Vegas for the first time this year. I'd never been there before. Those hotels are insane. They're so big, right? So if somebody's having an issue, you know, even unrelated to sexual harassment, like it could take a really long time to go all the way down to security and bring someone all the way back up again. So the panic buttons have been like another way in which, you know, workers feel a lot more secure at work. But, you know, there's problems with those too. They're not always like charged. They're not always working. You know, you have to be on top of it, like make sure your button's working. Not just assume that by the time you get to your floor, it's not working. Some of the other things that they talked about too, which is really getting to know the person that you're cleaning the room floor with, because you're always kind of cleaning the same rooms, and to get to know the customers. That was the part that I hadn't really thought about as a room attendant, that a lot of times people aren't there just for just one night. They're there for 2, 3, 4 nights. And so they get to know the customer so that they have a friendly relationship and a rapport with them. So if anything does go wrong, like they kind of have like a bystander who can intervene. And that was something that I hadn't thought a lot about. And during the pandemic, when the industry just tanked, a lot of room attendants who are still working found themselves working by themselves on multiple floors with very little, with only very few rooms full. And that was really scary for a lot of room attendants because they didn't feel like they had anybody there who was like a witness. And they were often, they were being moved from floor to floor regularly, so they weren't getting to know the customers as well. And so since the pandemic and room occupancy has increased almost to pre-pandemic times, that's made a big difference. Going back to the pre-pandemic of like 2 people on the floor, getting to know your customers. So there's a lot of like very informal ways that workers can make themselves be a lot safer and have kind of bystanders to witness things if there's an issue. Yeah.
I think people often think about unions as vehicles for improving people's economic circumstances, whether that's getting better wages, better healthcare, having a pension, being able to retire with dignity. But of course, as you know, and for those of you who've been in the union world, that, you know, there's so many other things that we bargain for,
Right.
that really comes down to more fundamental issues around respect for people's bodies, respect for time, and are so important. And it's funny that you're mentioning COVID, because I was thinking about, you know, so many people left their jobs during COVID and did something else. And there was a ton of research about why people were leaving their jobs. I think the AFL-CIO did a major, massive poll about why people were leaving their job and choosing another. And the number one issue was not wages and benefits, though that was up there. It really came down to workplace culture and people wanting to shift and change their workplace culture, whether that was a toxic culture of disrespect or all of the different things that you can imagine. So it has made me think a little bit more about this issue in an important way. And what I love about your research is how grounded it is in the real perspectives and everyday experiences of working people. So I'm curious, from, you know, the conversation that you've had with other workers, like how does this issue kind of fall among other kinds of issues that people are trying to fight for in their contract? And is there more that the labor movement should be doing right now to kind of lead on this issue? We obviously represent just a small fraction of the number of people who are out there working. And so knowing that this kind of workplace culture issue is so big, do you have thoughts about what people are saying and whether there's more that the labor movement can be doing to lead on this issue?
I mean, I think it's the top issue. I mean, I think, you know, in hospitality, you know, if you're in a union hotel, like in Chicago, I think it's about 60%. Las Vegas, like the Strip is 100% union now. I think I read that. Like all the hotels on the Strip are now unionized. So, but that's Las Vegas. Chicago, major tourism city, big convention city, it's maybe 65% of, they don't base it on like the hotels themselves, but the number of hotel rooms are unionized in like downtown Chicago. And so, but what that means is for the other non-union hotels, those workers may make like the same hourly wage as a unionized worker will make, because those hotels have to pay on par with the union wage to make sure that they're getting enough workers. What they won't have is maybe benefits or, you know, a pension, certainly not. But what they also don't have is like a feeling of respect and dignity, right? And I think that's what the unionized workers really feel like is so important to them, is that because they have the ability to grieve something, even if they don't need to grieve something, they know that they have the ability to do that, leads to a greater sense of respect and dignity. And when they don't, you know, in the case of HMS Host, I mean, that was a big piece of the grievance, and the campaign around that grievance was, you know, if you remember the 1968 sanitation workers strike, picket signs that said, "I am a man," right? I mean, that sanitation strike was about respect and dignity as much as it was about low pay and unsafe working conditions. I mean, those were like obviously things that were bargained over, but what was so brilliant about that campaign that the union led and the workers led was that this is about respect and dignity. We're tired of being treated like second-class citizens, right? And so when they had the HMS Host grievance, they mimicked those signs. They kind of used that 1968 sanitation workers, you know, like, I am a worker, I am a man. And they thought at first that like the women would be like upset that like the language was like, I am a man, but they're like, no, we're on board with this because this is about like, you know, it's harkening back to this memory of like civil rights, right? And we're talking about racism that's happening here. I mean, a worker was raped, you know, in the airport, right? So we're talking about respect and dignity as much as anything else. And I think that's why they won the grievance. They really framed it around that. What was interesting with that case was that so many of the supervisors, which I didn't know until I showed up in the room to do the training, almost all the supervisors were immigrants.
Mhm.
And they're overwhelmingly from the Philippines.
Mm.
And this isn't to like say that it's okay to be racist or whatever, but like they did not know the history of the United States. Like they didn't understand like the I am a man, right? Like they had to, like we had to give all this context about enslavement and the reason that, you know, like they had done, they had done a bunch of really racist stuff around in the dining hall and the supervisors, not that they all like had an aha moment, but there was like a cultural divide between like sort of the African-American workers and these like relatively new immigrant workers who are now supervisors. And like, why is this an issue, right? And they hadn't been educated on why this was an issue. And so that was an interesting dynamic of that training that we had not anticipated or kind of baked into the curriculum. But yeah, I think that is really high on the list. And I think when they're doing new organizing, organizing a non-union workplace, that respect and dignity is as important and is probably more important than the fact that folks know they're going to get a raise or they might get health insurance. One case, one of the women leaders at a non-union hotel, she was part of organizing that hotel. It's now a union hotel with a contract. She was like, well, now I can get divorced, right? Because now I have a union that pays enough and I have benefits and I can file for divorce. So it was not even just respect and dignity in the workplace, but now she was like demanding respect and dignity at home. And I don't, you know, there's no data on that because that's really tricky data to get, but there's plenty of anecdotal evidence around
A lot.
women like feeling like now that I have respect and dignity in the workplace, I can demand that same kind of treatment at home. And I just saw the worker on Pickle Line in the papers just came through like that day. It was Valentine's Day. You know, but she's still a low-wage worker and she's still not making that much money, so her ex-husband's still living in the house, right? But they're divorced now, you know, so it's like baby steps, right? But yeah, so I think there's a lot of different layers to that.
You shared with us a little bit today about what you've seen in the hospitality industry, obviously. And you know, love that you are looking at Unite Here and looking at this longer history, which is just, you know, something that's so helpful to us as we're thinking about our work. But what are you seeing in other sectors of the service economy in terms of what labor advocacy groups or their unions are doing, what workers are doing to kind of resist the culture of sexual harassment in their workplace?
Yeah, I mean, so the book is looking also at flight attendants and domestic workers, and historically domestic workers, overwhelmingly women of color, you know, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And there was throughout the South, you know, so, I mean, you probably all know this in this room, but right, domestic workers were excluded from the National Labor Relations Act. So they don't have protections under labor law. So what are you supposed to do if you don't have protections under labor law, right? And on top of it, you're like working by yourself in somebody's home. And so there's been a lot of activism since the 60s around professionalizing that industry. So starting community organizations that have gone all the way through up until today, where there have been like, you know, domestic workers' bill of rights that have been passed in different states that have tried to like kind of address the fact that they're not protected by labor law. I mean, the number of times, like each decade in New York State in particular, they kept trying to pass like labor laws to protect domestic workers, and they always went under. I mean, it's only recently that there's been, you know, a domestic workers' bill of rights in New York State, and that's just that state. I think California might have it too, but that's it. So I think a big piece of that is organizing so that they have community organizations so that if there is an incident in the workplace, because they're still working in people's private homes as nannies, cleaners, that kind of thing, they have a place they can go and like find solutions, right? Sort of like a resource center. And also getting back to this idea of, you know, respect and dignity is that you can sort of claim more respect and dignity. And I thought it was really interesting. So Dorothy Bolden in Atlanta, in Georgia, organized this domestic workers organization in the 60s. And it basically was like a worker center for domestic workers. So if somebody wanted to hire a domestic worker, instead of just like putting an ad in the paper, which is the common way to do it, or just through word of mouth for your church or community or whatever, you would go to the domestic workers center, and you would ask to hire a domestic worker who was like, you know, part of this organization, paid membership dues to the organization. It was like a union. It was like an clearinghouse. And what was nice about it was that the organization helped the employer, so the person seeking a domestic worker, to discuss with the worker what their expectations were. And you can go through the archives and see, like, when cleaning the living room, you know, like, don't move don't move things, don't put things, or in the kitchen, don't put things in the cabinets, just clean and put them back where they are, like, because some people don't want their stuff touched, right? And it seems so silly, but it's like everything's spelled out, so you don't end up having these like passive aggressive moments because like the housewife who's hired this domestic worker is uncomfortable to say something to them. It's all kind of mediated through this third party, this domestic worker organization. And so that kind of is carried through up until today. Similar kinds of organizations that have also then lobbied for legislation. And, you know, amongst flight attendants, what was really interesting is when flight attendants, you know, we know sort of like, you know, the airline industry completely sexualized flight attendants and turned them into these like hypersexual kind of Barbie doll people, and use them to like, as competition to kind of vie for the business traveler with their airline, right? Like fly with us, fly me. And there's like this, you know, scantily clad flight attendants standing there. And they had really strict, you know, you had to weigh a certain amount, you had to weigh under a certain weight, you had to be single, you had to be white, you had to be female, you couldn't get pregnant, you couldn't get married. And as soon as Civil Rights Act passed and the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, was established, flight attendants were the first ones to file claims to the EEOC against these kinds of policies. Because you could show up at work and if, you know, and they would be like, okay, today's a weigh-in day. And if you were a pound over the limit, you would get suspended, right? And we all know our weight fluctuates based on our cycles and all sorts of other medical reasons. And so for any given day, you could have had a busy night out drinking, right? And you're retaining water. Oh, now you're on leave until you lose the weight, right? Which is, you know, just humiliating as well. And so but those lawsuits, I mean, in some cases took 10, 15 years to pursue. And so there was a Stewardesses for Equal Rights campaign that kind of came out of the women's movement in the 70s. And the other thing that happened was the flight attendants were in the pilot union. So they were in a union, but it was the pilots union. I mean, it said flight attendant, but it was the pilots union. The pilots were the ones who were negotiating the contracts. And so the flight attendants basically got like nothing in their contracts. It was just like lip service. And so the flight attendants all left those unions and formed their own unions. And so now there's separate pilots union and flight attendants union. That didn't happen until the 70s and 80s. Even though flight attendants have been around since the 30s and 40s. And flight attendants were originally hired as nurses. Like the first flight attendants were actually trained nurses. These are just supposed to be on the airplane to make sure like you didn't die, right? Or have a health crisis. Which we lost track of. And I think 9/11, we were talking about this lunch, right? Like 9/11 was like kind of that moment where people are like, oh yeah, they're trained in like health and safety and like medical, you mean they have medical training to be able to do their jobs. And then I think too, since the pandemic, you know, we're much more aware of like how we treat flight attendants, right? And demanding that sort of, I don't know, it's like TV show The Pit, right? Where they're like, pointing to the sign about like, you have to treat me with dignity. You can't abuse me, right? Like that's the idea with the flight attendants as well, right? But that's like been a long time ago. And it's and all of the unions, the union activism was what forced the employers to change their and even, I mean, internationally, there's still some like, you know, there's still some airlines that are using this sort of sexualization of the flight attendants to get clients. But
Well, and the outbursts and the uptick in emotional dysregulation from guests and customers in hospitals, in all of these public areas, we certainly hear that. So that there's no question that hugely important. Well, I love your book in terms of drawing these connections, because I think sometimes, at least within the union book, we almost think of these things in isolation within the industry, sort of the ability for workers to see each other's struggles. And I couldn't help but think about models organizing and what they've been able to do without the protections of the law as independent contractors, but some of the protections they've been able to win in New York City. And of course, as we've seen the Jeffrey Epstein, scandal unfold, and how just the kind of depths of abuse and exploitation and trafficking that we've seen in that industry, and where that could hold. So I think this is just so exciting what you're doing. I would love to open it up to questions that you all may have for Emily.
So firstly, thank you so much, Emily, for the presentation. Thank you both for the discussion. I want to get your take on this a little bit. So it's kind of a twofold question. Firstly, I inherited a union position that, like, a couple years before me, had gone to the state federation convention, and they just had a knockdown, drag out fight on sexual harassment protection in the contracts that made workers more or less vulnerable, because it's something that the workers could then be charged with. And so there was this hotbed, intense fight about it. When my local brought questions about this to our employer and said, well, let's get these statements in the contract, the employer simply said, no, there's state and federal laws here.
Right.
You don't need it in the contract if it's law. So, and I mean, historically, all right, some unions still need extra protection what the law is providing. But when you're getting this data research with so few unions having this, what is the explanation for 1 out of 9 contracts having some of this language? Is it, were they pointing to they were turned down at the bargaining table because of the law? Or were the rank and file just not pushing behind it? I mean, what's the explanation for how it got, like, where we are right now?
Getting more language in?
Yeah, and why it hasn't gained that traction?
Well, I think in hospitality, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, I think it's like the Me Too movement, right? And the Dominic Strauss-Kahn, and just, there was a real push. There was a push to pass legislation that now exists in multiple states around these panic buttons. So like Illinois, for example, all hotel workers are supposed to have panic buttons. There's statewide legislation that came out of the Chicago Unite Here Local 1 campaign to pass a city ordinance. Now there's a statewide ordinance. Now, does the, room attendant at the Holiday Inn in Peoria know that she or he is supposed to have a panic button? Probably not. Is the Holiday Inn that is non-union in Peoria providing the panic button? Probably not. And there's no real mechanism. So, but I think in the union context, it's really been this kind of like local organizing has pushed the international union to now say, okay, we're going to send out model language to all our locals and say, we really want you to prioritize this language in the collective. When you're negotiating, we're going to try to get common language in all of our, contracts around this. And that's that language I showed earlier where it says guests, whatever. Not the longer Bodrick Barnes one, but that sort of sample language is in a lot of contracts now. And when I was in Vegas, I was talking to them and they're like, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's like in all our contracts now, some variation of that. Some, interestingly, it starts out as a side agreement or like a memorandum of understanding, which is like not, it's still part of the contract. Like you have to uphold it as an employer, but it's like it's like an addendum, and then the next round of negotiations, the goal is to get it into the contract itself. So it's its own article. So I think it was a lot of local, like the panic button work was done in Seattle and was done in Chicago, and then it kind of spread. The Me Too movement around Weinstein brought in hotel workers to that, like it raised more attention for hotel workers, not just Hollywood starlets. And so I think it really pushed the international union to say, okay, this is like, we need to get this. And I've been talking to different union leaders, one union leader in Minnesota was saying that since Trump's election, she has noticed some employers have been like pushing back on trying to get this into their contract. They do in Minnesota, I didn't have the language up there. Their airport language is like phenomenal. Like it's like, you know, on steroids compared to what that other one is. It's like really super inclusive about LGBTQ folks, and it's like much broader, you know, around respect and dignity stuff too. And I feel like she was basically like, that's harder to get now that Trump is in office. I've talked to other union leaders who say that's not the case. I mean, I think, you know, for hotels, it's like it costs money to have to like litigate this stuff, right? And it costs their reputation because they know that Unite here is really good at like public relations, right? And Maria's spearheaded a lot of that, right? And I think Unite here has gotten a lot better at public relations by hiring communication staff at the different locals now to like push those messaging out using social media more. I mean, the labor movement was like really bad at social media. It's like only under the newest AFL-CIO leadership has there been any, like, I was like, oh my God, like, how do you not use social media? It's unbelievable. They keep saying they want like the next generation involved, and it's like, they don't even have like any basic social media accounts. But I feel like that they're waking up to a little bit, but I do think it has to come from the international down. But in order to get the international to do it, you got to get a bunch of locals like really pissed off and push the international to do it, right? And I don't think it's enough to just to say it's state and federal, right? I think you need to have language that's specific to your workplace. Somebody else have another question?
Jeremy?
Yeah, I echo thanks both of you. Really got a ton out of this. I wanted to only respond to one of your questions and also raise a question. So, you know, you asked like, why is it not considered a health and safety issue? Why is it like a special thing, right? And I mean, I think there's like a gendered aspect to that, even though sexual harassment happens to everyone, it's seen as a women's issue primarily by employers. But also anything, you know, the history of health and safety is workers saying this is our job and our job needs to be safe, and employers saying, well, this is an individual problem. And if you just didn't do it, right? If you just operated the machinery more safely, or didn't stick your hand in there or whatever, right? It's always trying to shift the burden. And anything that has any type of, you know, morality attached to it, like sexual harassment or my own work using substances, like it's so easy to push that off and say, well, that's just that's not about our work.
Right.
That's not about the structure of the labor process, the situations our employees are placed in. It's just about bad people, right? It's bad apples, and like people just need to be different, and that's not my problem. And so I think that there's that sense that that there's this like disconnect between saying, no, this is like, we work in a hotel, there are people walking around naked, and, you know, that's just gonna happen.
It's their house.
That happens more here than it would at GM. So we need a different kind of health and safety model, right? Although, you know, sexual harassment is endemic to the auto industry.
The stories I could tell you about the Ford plant in Chicago.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it also is very much shaped by the particular, as you know, like workplace and where people are and when, you know, where people are alone is a big one. And the other thing, so that gets to my next question. You know, a lot of times when people bring up issues of health and safety, employers want to respond to it, but they want to respond to it their way. They don't want to do what workers want, right? And the thing what you're saying about having people together, you know, like there's so much violence in the healthcare industry. And a lot of times I know unions and candidates that we need more people. Like it's not going to happen. A patient is not going to grab me anywhere near as often as if there's actually enough staffing and there's somebody in the room with you. But employers say, well, let's put a camera. Right. And how much do you see that as a dynamic in these struggles that employers are kind of wanting to respond to this with surveillance, which also gives them more access into workers and maybe more control over them. Yeah. Rather than kind of responding to what workers are saying to me. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think hotels tricky with the surveillance, right? I do think that they think the panic buttons will just solve that problem, right? And I think this was like, there has been it's only been in the kind of union strongholds where there's been, and maybe you could speak to this more, Anne Marie, like they're starting to get back to the staffing levels that they had pre-pandemic, but it's been like a big like push in negotiations to make sure that hotels aren't like sticking to like, oh, well, we functioned fine during the pandemic, you know, and we have this green campaign. So now people just don't want their room cleaned as often, right? And that's a real education campaign. Like, I mean, you want your room cleaned because that's someone's job,
right? We all feel like, oh, I want to help her out. Like, you don't have to clean my room. It's like, no, you want your room clean. Don't put the no service sign on your door. You're not really saving any towels, right? Like, you're not saving the environment by not having your room cleaned. You're basically just like,
Although Airbnb's got clean too, they're not gonna.
yeah, right.
Enough, but I want
but
to
you-
go to a hotel where people employed to do this.
To do this job, right? And they're really not worried, Marriott's not worried about the environment. They're worried about keeping their labor costs down. They could give a crap, right? Like, there's no recycling bins, right? They're still using whatever. They're not composting. Those things would be much more important than whether or not someone's like changing my towels out. Yeah. So I think, I think the panic buttons are definitely like, oh, well, we can just put these panic buttons and now we don't have to have as many people on the floor. And they've been trained and they know it's in the contract, so they're more aware of that. I'd be curious, I should definitely ask that question of the flight attendants union, because I mean, that's definitely a surveillance space in major ways for a lot of reasons. But if they've seen an uptick in, like, oh, okay, we'll surveil more, but not bring, not have as many flight attendants on the, on the plane, or, I think there's more regulation around that. But yeah, I haven't seen it as much in terms of that surveillance, but but I'm not looking at hospitals, and I have done some work on hospitals, and that's definitely the case in hospital, right? I did a survey of Chicago area nurses and violence, and, keeping, labor costs way down and just putting in cameras everywhere and a security guard here and there. And they think that's going to solve the problem. But when it's really, people are just like emotional and they're frustrated, and they're at like the most stressful time of their life, they're in the freaking hospital. That's scary, right? And then they're waiting there for 4 hours, and of course people are going to react,
Yeah.
You become your worst self. Hopefully in a hotel, you're at your best because you're supposed to be on vacation. But, people get stressed. And I think we're just like way more stressed. Like, everybody's just stressed. Like, it's just, life is stressful since the pandemic. And like, I used to love flying. Now it's like, I hate it. I forgot a mask. The person was coughing up their kidney behind me, and I was getting super stressed. I put my earbuds in, almost my book really, really loud, because I was like, I wanted to yell, and I'm not that person, right? So it's, yeah, I definitely think it's a more dangerous time emotionally for people,
Well, I'll just co-sign the issue around staffing levels. It's real. Every time there is a major crisis where the hospitality industry collapses. This happened around 9/11. This happened during the recession. It happened again with COVID. The industry thinks of it as kind of the silver lining to permanently make reductions in the number of people who are working. And if just to take kind of a step back in terms of the work of hotel housekeeping, it really makes no sense that there is just one person who is cleaning a room. They have 15 minutes, a half an hour to do it. Those mattresses weigh 100 pounds. So you could imagine that if we were really thinking holistically about what would be the safest conditions for a person who, and by the way, it's women who do this work, who are in a hotel floor that could be, as you said, in Las Vegas, there's miles and miles of they're so big. So to think about being alone, what would be the safest conditions for somebody who would have to be working in pairs? But that doesn't happen anywhere, and it all has to do with the bottom line. So and that's only gotten worse. And I think the stress that people feel at work is also a direct result of the fact we are all working more, and that takes a toll on us physically and emotionally and spiritually, all of the different ways. So there's no question that so many of these different things could be answered in terms of health and safety if we just have more staff on who are working.
Yeah, and if you had 2 people cleaning a room at a time, you zip through the rooms, right?
Yes.
But yeah.
Yeah.
Hi guys, my name is Callie, and so some background on me with this subject is I've been a server in the industry for like 10 years. My first serving job was at Bavarian Inn out in Frankenmuth, and I've worked in all across the state and in a variety of different places, and I've done a lot of hotel serving, mostly finer or more upscale dining, and I've done some like diner turn and brew style as well. And you had mentioned like interviewing workers and asking them like, have you experienced sexual harassment? And the workers were like, no. And then you kind of give more of a depth, like, surely this has happened, this has happened. And it's like, oh yeah, I guess that has occurred. And another aspect of that too, that I was making me think of is also, as someone who still serves and waits tables, when you're mentioning like, yeah, when these situations occur, I don't really think of it that way.
Right.
But in part because I worked in a precarious job and that's tipped wage work.
Mhm.
So there is the pressure too, and a concept that surrounds this sort of work where you don't register also because the sexual harassment pays.
Yeah.
It pays to be sexually harassed.
Yeah.
So my question is then when you're in these organizing spaces with workers, how can you encourage workers to adopt this language around sexual harassment where many people in the industry, servers, bartenders, whatever, are used to making that trade-off and what that would mean then for my income?
Yeah.
You know, like I'm being asked to, especially when you work in more upscale areas where it is, as we've seen in the elite class, especially right now, there is a trade-off between the profit that you get and what is allowed. And that's like, yeah, that's this VIP. We all know on staff that this person's weird, so just like, you know, where that person, she just doesn't wait on him or stuff like that.
Yeah.
But there is a level of acceptance because also, as much as I disagree with it, that guy tipped $100 and he always tips $100. So I don't want him to stop coming in.
Right.
So how do we encourage adoption of this language when I can see my own personal reluctancy in wanting to adopt that, and I can see other workers being like, let's not bring it up because we'll cut into my income.
I think that's a huge problem. I mean, I think that, the restaurant where I was a server in a union hotel was like a high-end place where it's like, we make good money, and so, my colleague, and we worked the system, right, of like who we thought we could maximize our tips with, right, for whatever reason. And we did make a higher hourly rate because it was a unionized hotel. And that definitely was like a psychological thing. Like, it was like, okay, I'm not going to put up with this person. And I know that my like hourly rate is high. So like when we got our paycheck every 2 weeks, it actually had money in it, because I forget whatever. I mean, it wasn't huge. It was like $8 an hour, but it was way more than $2.15, right? So like, I think for someone who's, kind of doing the diner thing and your tips aren't great, thinking about just switching to like $15 an hour, $20 an hour, that's a great deal. If you're working high end and you're walking with hundreds of dollars in your pocket, it's really hard to think about like, what does that change look like? So I think I do think it's like an educational kind of cultural shift of like, what does this mean to switch to a staffing model in which we're just all getting paid hourly and we're eliminating the tip system, or the tips are just automatic? I mean, I think that's the difference is like restaurants could just automatically put, like when you have a big party, six or more people, you automatically put that 18% on or that 20% on. Like every restaurant could just say, fine, we're just going to keep the tipping system, but it's just automatic. You got a 2 top, 20%. You got 3 top, 20%. And then it just all gets pulled out at the end. So you're still getting your tips, you're guaranteeing it, and you don't have to put up with the BS. Because most customers are not going to be like, can you take that 20% off? Right? Like we ate at whatever that noodle place is down the street, and there's a 3% service charge on there. And so I asked the server, I was like, what is this 3% service charge? And she's like, it's not the tip. It's so the employer doesn't have to raise the cost of the menu items. I was like, but I can take it off if you want. And I was like, it's fine. Right? Like, I'm not going to tell her to take the 3% off, right? And it kind of makes sense, but it kind of didn't make sense. I mean, I don't know. Source it is.
Who's getting the 3%? The server
The restaurants. It's the restaurant.
It's almost like credit card,
It's like Ticketmaster, like, yeah.
you don't want to change the sticker price.
But
Yeah.
you're still paying more for the,
Because you look at the back end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then-
People read their.
right.
I mean, it's listed there and it says service charge. And I asked about it. And I mean, even if it happened to tip, I still would have tipped the 20% because that's the industry I come out of. But I do think that there are ways but the problem is that the National Restaurant Association is an incredibly powerful lobbying agent, and to make that shift so that servers, especially high-end servers, are still protected and still earning comparable, because it's also a high-skilled job. To be a high-end server is like a lot of training, a lot of work, and you should get paid comparably, right? And I think unionized servers do better in that way, and there's like a little bit of a culture shift, but no, I mean, that's exactly the problem in the US context, right? Is that where it's just, you want to make that money. And it's like the lottery too. Like, you always think the next table is going to buy that $400 bottle of wine. Like, they're going to be the one that, like, you know, are going to buy the big wine, or they're going to be the big tipper. You know, and so that's kind of part of the fun if you like the industry, right? So that is a big change that has to happen. And I don't, in the current context, I don't see any of that happening. But yeah. I was talking to somebody who's an academic now. He used to be a flight attendant. And I asked him how they handled the same scenario. Like, you know, that one customer that's like, do you make a complaint to the purser, to the pilot? They said, no, we just, like, if I'm working this section, I just switch it out with the other person. Like, then that's the everyday resistances, right? Like, you just self-manage, right? Okay, now I'm going to have this person do that section because I know they have more seniority and they're sassier and they can handle that client, and that customer, and I'll just move to this section and set it up, you know, instead of that in the airplane, and they would just kind of manage it themselves unless the customer was really disruptive. And that's another piece of the book project, is like, what are the little everyday resistances that we do to, like, that don't make any big institutional change, aren't radical changes, aren't going to show up in a collective bargaining agreement or a piece of legislation or a court, but, you know, do we, like, just intentionally mess up their cappuccino, or do we, you know, drop something on the ground and just stuck it back on the plate, right? Like, all those little things. One oral history was like it was just like 60s, Janice, do you remember Janice Lou from Boston? Yeah, her mom dumped a bowl of peas on a customer's head. She just finally got so fed up with the harassment, right? But, you know, so the things that we do that, like, and because she had a union, she didn't get fired.
Yeah.
She didn't have a union.
We probably have time for one more question. Yes,
Well, actually, no more.
oh, no.
No.
I'm just gonna, want to thank you both for coming today. And for doing this wonderful presentation. We have the room for another 20 minutes, and we, at this point, just everybody break up, spend some time.
Yeah, mingle.
Come up and meet the speaker.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, for being here.
Yeah.